Hello, and in this episode of the UX Tea Break, I answer that old chestnut: should UX designers be able to code? This particular question comes from Janice Pusey. Janice is a student in one of my Udemy classes, and she says, I'm about to recruit a UX designer on my team. Is it important that they can write code? And if so, what programming languages should they know? So I was a bit reluctant to answer this question, to be honest, because I think it's a bit like Brexit. Whichever way I come down on this, I'm going to alienate half my audience. So I thought, first of all, I should give you some details about my own background. So I am able to code. So for the evidence for that is, if we go back to 1991, that just shows you how old I am. I wrote a book called Effective Colour Displays. I've written a more recent book since then, a couple of them in fact, but in this particular one I included some code snippets written in C that people could use to do colour space manipulation. So I've got a background in coding, which means I think I can speak about it from a point of authority. So I would then say that, well, what are the strengths of being able to code as a UX designer? And I'd say that one of the strengths is that you're able to know what kind of things take a few hours to program and what kind of things take days or weeks to program. In other words, you're able to make trade-offs and you're not going to ask the development team to do stupid things. Another advantage, I think, is that you have a particular way of thinking. You have a kind of a logical, systematic, mathematical, algorithmic way of thinking about problems, and I think that's useful in design as well as being a useful attribute that coders have. So you'd think that would mean I would come down on the side of saying yes, UX designers should be able to code, but I don't think it's as simple as that. The reason is I've worked with some really talented UX designers who haven't been able to code. And I've also worked with some mediocre UX designers who have been able to code. So I don't think there's a correlation between being able to code and being good at UX design. In fact, that got me thinking, what is the key attribute that a UX designer needs to have? What's the key skill that they need on the team? If I'm recruiting somebody for my team, what do I want them to be able to do? And I would say that the key thing you want to get them to do, their most important job, is to be able to come up with prototypes that can be tested with users, that they can come up with manifestations of their design idea that they can then use to test the hypotheses they have about the design. Now, if they do that in code, then that's fine, but it doesn't have to be code that you come up with those prototypes in. You might want a prototype in Sketch, or in Figma, or in Adobe XD, or in Axure, or in one of the many other tools that are available at the moment that people can do prototyping in. And you might want to choose those tools often rather than code, because you might be wanting to do a test of a big design concept, which is easier to put together in a prototyping tool than it might be if you were needing to programming it. Similarly, you might be interested in designing or testing out a interaction design idea, and it might take a lot of effort to put that in code, whereas it's something that you could mock up quickly in a prototype. In fact, I think this skill of prototyping is so important. It's something that I encourage UX researchers to be able to do as well, because then they don't need to bother designers to test out some of their simpler concepts. Even if you only know how to prototype in something like Keynote or PowerPoint, you can put something together that can then be tested and put in front of users, and you can check, does this concept work? So I'd say the key thing here is being able to prototype, not being able to code. That's what you want your UX designer to do. Because there's also a risk if they can code. If they're part of a development team, let's say they're part of a Scrum team, and they can code, and suddenly the team gets overwhelmed with work that requires more coding, then what will happen is that person will be taken off design and they'll be put onto coding instead. Even if they can't do production ready code, they'll still be moved onto the team to do that. Secondly, if you're just recruiting an individual that you're expecting to do lots of different tasks, design being one, and you also expect them to code, what you're after there is a full stack developer, and that means if you get them doing all those other tasks, they're going to be spending less time doing design, and I clearly think you should be having someone on your team that's dedicated to doing design. So the way I would come down on this question is I would say UX designers don't need to be able to code. If they can code, it's an asset and it's useful to have, but it's definitely not an entry requirement. Well, I hope that answers your question, Janice. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and ask a question below, and I'll get around to it in a future UX Tea Break video.